And these are my trinkets right now. I may be using, and I'll be using Luby for this. Let's go ahead and get started. I might make this an hour. I'm gonna get to like 420 or something. But never guaranteed. And I'm probably gonna be hearing facts about Titanic right now.
In 547 BC, there's a city known as Sardis. And during this time, the city of Sardis was under the rule of Croesus, the king of Lydia. The kingdom of Lydia, for context, would be in modern-day Turkey. Now, what's interesting about Sardis is that the city is extremely well fortified, both geographically and architecturally. And what I mean by this is that Sardis wasn't only just a city with huge castle walls, it also was built on top of very steep mountains. Meaning that this is one place that you would not want to try to siege, simply because of how unoptimal this place would be to attack. Croesus would have such an advantage when it comes to high ground and visibility and knowledge of how to navigate the landscape. Anybody who would try to attack and siege the city would essentially have a death wish. That was until Cyrus the Great entered the chat. Cyrus the Great heard that Croesus was actually busy doing some other battles that he wasn't doing too well in. And because Croesus wasn't doing so well, he disbanded his troops and was basically taking the winter off to try to refight in the next spring. But when Cyrus the Great got word that Croesus was disbanding his troops, he figured now would be the perfect time to try to siege this impossible city. And that's what happened. Cyrus and his troops showed up on the ground outside of Sardis, and Croesus, kind of shocked that they were even there, quickly gathered all of the troops that were within the castle walls, and a battle ensued. Interestingly, Cyrus actually won this initial battle outside of the castle walls. However, Sardis was still not sieged, and was still believed to be unsiegeable. And Croesus himself was still confident they would never get inside the city walls, and his confidence wasn't unfounded. There was literally ancient prophecies stating that this well-fortified city could never be captured. That was until one tiny mistake was made. One motivated soldier in Cyrus's army was taking a walk around the mountain when he found himself near the back of this massive mountain, simply looking up and watching the city, when he noticed one of the Lydian guards at the top of the hill. The Lydian guard didn't notice the soldier, so the soldier just watched him to see if there was anything he could learn. And what happened definitely changed history. The Lydian soldier, not paying attention, accidentally dropped his helmet down the hill. And because he didn't know that he was being watched, he went ahead and retrieved his helmet. But as he retrieved his helmet, he inadvertently exposed the only vulnerable position of the entire city. And after this Persian soldier watched this Lydian soldier go from the city of Sardis down to gather his helmet and then back up almost effortlessly, he knew he had some crazy intel. And later that night, that same Persian soldier went back to the same location, tried to retrace the steps of that Lydian soldier that he saw, which he was able to do successfully. He shared this information with his army, and the rest is history. With their golden ticket into Sardis, Cyrus and his men laid siege to Sardis for 14 days, eventually capturing it. And it was with this siege that the Persian Empire grew stronger. And I guess it goes to show, no matter how fortified you think you are, never expose your back door. Hitler sleeping in on D-Day. June 6, 1944 signifies a massive win for the Allied powers in World War II. American, Canadian, and British forces were able to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied Normandy and France, giving them the leverage to truly sink their teeth into the Axis powers, allowing them to ultimately win the war. And while we're all grateful that things worked out this way, why did it work out this way? At the time, there was a very real and dystopian possibility that the Nazis could have won D-Day. History would have looked a lot different. But that's a bit off topic. The biggest contributors to the Allied powers' success on D-Day comes down to two major points. One being the Allied powers' general clever strategy, the second being a general lack of planning and communication in preparation for this attack. And when I say in preparation, I mean the Germans knew that the coast of France was susceptible to an attack, and they were at this point expecting it. But the only problem was they didn't know where the Allied forces would attack, and this was the major problem internally. Hitler and other high-ranking officials believed that Pas-de-Calais is undoubtedly where the Allied powers would try to land. However, other officials believed that Normandy was also a possibility. There was no general consensus on where they could have landed, and Hitler's solution was to spread out troops all across France's shoreline. And while this seems logical, it had a major flaw. No one individual location was extremely well equipped, and when the invasion did happen, it would take some time for a counterattack from the Germans to gather all of the other troops from the shoreline to the one area where the actual battle was happening. This mismanagement alone could be considered its own historical mistake, but it doesn't end there. Due to some previous red herrings that the Allied powers threw, specifically staging a false invasion on Pas-de-Calais, when the actual attack on D-Day happened, German troops weren't sure if this was a...
There is a lot about the job that isn't actually that fun, that I have now automated away.
Invasion on Pas-de-Calais, when the actual attack on D... Every time the world almost ended. I don't know about you guys, but to me, it seems like doomsday scares are only becoming more and more common. Every day, we're either being told that the world is going to end or actively ending, and honestly, I'm just sick of it. If you're old enough to qualify for a senior's discount, then you might remember the Y2K scare of the year 2000. And if you're at least old enough to use this website, then you might remember the 2012 scare where the world was supposed to end as well. Regardless, all of these fake world-ending events got me thinking, what were genuine times in history when the world was its closest to ending? And well, my findings are this video. And as always, this video is only going to get crazier as it goes on. The Carrington event. It's a warm summer's night on August 28, 1859. The sun had only just set, and this night was supposed to be like any other. Typically, after the sun sets, the sky only gets darker and darker. However, on this night, the sky was illuminated like never before. Eyewitnesses report that the sky appeared to be illuminated from the heavens, and others mentioned how the sky was a deep red as if it were engulfed by a wildfire. The night sky was so bright, in fact, that it actually awoke gold miners working in the Rocky Mountains, and they not only woke up but began their workday in the middle of the night because they assumed the sun had risen. And it's reported that in New York you could even read the newspaper at midnight due to how bright the night sky was. With this being said, it begs the question, what was in the night sky? Was it an asteroid? Was it a wildfire? Well, some of you might have already guessed that it was the aurora borealis. But these were no regular northern lights. The lights that were seen in the night sky on August 28th were visible for nearly a week. But it's not just the duration that's impressive. These lights were visible globally. Not only was the aurora visible from the North and South Poles, but it was also visible through North America, South America, Cuba, Hawaii, Japan, China, and even New Zealand. But this aurora wasn't just a pretty light show. Although it was an interesting spectacle to witness at night, during the day, this aurora was wreaking havoc on the rather simple technology that existed, most notably telegraphs. Because of the geomagnetic-induced current from the electromagnetic field, telegraphs all across the world failed. But not only did they fail, they even shocked the operators. Telegraphs in some locations were sparking, breaking, and curiously, in some locations, telegraph operators were disconnecting their batteries from the telegraphs, and the telegraphs would still work without power. There's even a recorded conversation between two telegraph operators in Boston and Portland, who both disconnected the batteries from their telegraphs, but were still able to have a 2-hour-long conversation. And while this is interesting, it doesn't necessarily sound apocalyptic. And well, you'd be right, and that's because the Carrington event was caused by a massive solar flare, an event that is typically pretty harmless to humans. However, I wanted to mention it first in this video for two reasons. One, because it's the most tame entry on this list we're going to discuss, and two, because it's extremely interesting to theorize what would have happened if this solar storm happened in the modern day, a day where we rely so heavily on technology. And luckily, we don't have to speculate, because in June of 2013, a joint venture from researchers at Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Committee used real data from the Carrington event to estimate the cost of a similar event in the modern day. And what they estimated was that if the Carrington event took place in 2013, it would have cost in the US alone $600 billion to $2.6 trillion in damages, which at the time would have ranged from roughly 3 to 15% of the annual GDP for the entire country. But numbers aside, what would this look like for humans? And the reality is scary. Most of the world would experience one of the biggest blackouts of all time. And this blackout alone would cause major issues, such as lack of communications, lack of transportation, lack of refrigeration, and so much more. Traffic lights would go down, hospitals would lose power, air traffic control would lose communication with planes, grocery stores would be empty, looting and riots would begin. Like, seriously, just imagine if the world lost electricity for even 2 weeks straight. Now imagine that going on for months, and maybe even years. So much would be going wrong. Besides just that, all banking and purchases would be unavailable, supply chains would basically completely halt, and the economy and likely civilization would be set back hundreds of years, if not eliminated entirely. And that's really not an exaggeration. If a Carrington event took place in the modern day, and it was not detected in advance and precautions were not taken in advance, then it's estimated that it would take up to a decade for all of the power grids that were affected by the solar storm to be fully restored. Now, before you get too scared about a whole modern day Carrington event, understand that with modern technology, we would be able to detect and plan for a Carrington level event to ensure that none of this happens. But before I give you too much hope, understand that some experts say that Carrington level events take place every roughly 150 years. And the last Carrington event was 160 years ago, meaning that to some, we could be overdue. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is likely one of the most famous historical situations that had relatively minimal casualties, but could have potentially resulted in the most casualties ever recorded. I think it's safe to assume that most of us are familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, I will give a brief summary for those who are not so familiar. But beyond that, I want to focus not only on the entire situation, but on some of the more notable events that took place within the missile crisis that brought us inches from nuclear war between two of the world's largest superpowers. In October of 1962, the Soviet Union decided to secretly put nuclear missiles within Cuba. This secret operation was quickly...
Need better internet? Cox Internet has the fast, reliable speeds you're looking for. Get Cox 300 meg internet with a 2-year plan, price lock guarantee, plus equipment included. Switch today. Taxes and fees excluded from price guarantee.
Operation was quickly exposed to the American government, and instantly concerns were high. Why are the Soviets breaking their agreement, and why are they putting nuclear warheads 90 miles away from our soil? Tensions were obviously at an all-time high, and slow communication and language barriers did not make the situation any easier. Once these secret missiles were exposed, the US government knew they had to respond, but they had to also be strategic because they knew the wrong response could result in nuclear war. It's kind of ironic because at this time, America already had nuclear warheads in Turkey off the coast of Russia. However, with the Soviets now having nukes off the coast of America, things were serious. And while I know that's an oversimplified explanation, it's kind of all I got for right now. But one interesting observation I'll make was that although tensions were extremely high, from my understanding, the leaders of both the United States and the Soviet Union did not want to go into a nuclear war. Obviously, because they both knew very well that this could result in the end of humanity. However, for the soldiers that were actually on site, seeing their enemy directly in front of them, the urge to take shots and potentially start a war was a lot more appealing. And it's actually those situations that I want to talk about. During the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, the US President John F. Kennedy really just wanted to find the best way to have the missiles removed from Cuba peacefully. And the leader of the Soviet Union kind of just wanted to have their secret operation to be swept under the rug without repercussion. And obviously the result of the entire crisis was a mutual agreement to have nukes removed from Cuba and Turkey. However, what took place during the 13 days of the crisis left humanity inches from ceasing to exist. One notable incident that took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis happened on October 25th, 1962. It was late at night at the Duluth, Minnesota military base, when one of the guards noticed a suspicious figure climbing the fence into the military base. Obviously, the guard understood what was going on and realized that this military base was under attack. He quickly ran to his post and pulled a sabotage alarm. However, by some, the sabotage alarm was misunderstood and was actually taken as an alarm that activated a launch alert at Volk Field in Wisconsin. And this launch alert that was activated at Volk Field prompted the immediate deployment of nuclear-armed jets. With these nuclear-armed jets having their sights aimed at basically anything Soviet, if one of them were to have fired on Soviet or potentially even Cuban troops, America would have likely been met with nuclear retaliation, sparking the first ever nuclear war. Now here's the interesting part. After these alarms were set off, it was discovered that there was no person sabotaging or climbing into the military base at all. What the guard had noticed was actually a bear climbing the military base fence. And with that discovery, the launch of the nuclear-armed planes was canceled with only minutes to spare before pilots took off and the first nuclear war ever would have begun. This was only one example of numerous odd situations that took place during an extremely tense time where the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was razor thin. And even mistaking a bear on a military base in Minnesota could have caused the world to end. World War II. Okay, hear me out. I figured if we're going to talk about the time we almost had a nuclear war, we should probably talk about the time there was literally nukes dropped within war. But I know I've talked about World War II a lot on this channel, so I'll keep this segment brief. I would say at this point, it's generally accepted that World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The entire 6-year war involved over 100 million people from 30 different countries, and battles literally took place on every continent beside Antarctica. And this entire brutal situation ended in 1945 when Germany surrendered to the Allied powers in May, and Japan was forced into submission in August when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. And while, once again, that's a massive oversimplification, you get the idea. World War II was hell on earth and literally killed an estimated 70 to 85 million, which was roughly 3% of the world's population at that time. So not only did the world almost end, but humanity lost 3% of its population, which is insane. But besides all of the crazy things that actually took place in World War II, let's discuss some of the things that almost took place. One of the most notable things that was bubbling was the development of nuclear bombs in the hands of the Nazis. That's right, after attacks on German soil, Hitler wanted to retaliate on American soil badly. He's even quoted saying that he wants to level all of New York and basically capture the rest of America. Hitler wanted so deeply to bring World War II to American soil that he was literally developing developing a bomber plane that could fly to America and back. And he just so happened at the same time to be developing a nuclear bomb as well. And unfortunately, the Nazis never got their hands on functioning nuclear bombs. I don't think it's hard to imagine what would have happened if they did. And the world that we live in today would look a lot different if it even still existed. And just imagine what would have happened if Japan decided to have nuclear retaliation against America. Japan had already successfully brought World War II to American soil. And if they happened to have had functional nukes and a death wish, then they too could have escalated World War II.
Actually, let me get a chair so I can sit down.
Only America had successfully developed nukes. And as a result, they essentially told the entire world to sit down. And the nukes that were dropped in Japan is still a lesson that has not been forgotten to this day. And I actually think that it's those nukes that were dropped in World War II that gave America and the Soviet Union so much reluctance to actually use the nukes that they were placing, which is a good thing. And thinking about these situations now, it's almost like comparing a balancing act to dominoes. Because in World War II, it seems like one domino hit another domino, and the situation kept escalating and escalating until more and more countries and more deaths happened, until at the very end, we saw nearly 100 million deaths, every continent, nearly every major country, and the most deadly weapons ever produced finally put a stop to the entire situation. However, with the missile crisis, the situation was a balancing act, trying to not go too far in either direction to actually trigger anything, because the tensions in technology were already so high.
Oh my gosh, I hate ads.
Unbeatable prices with select styles starting at just $4.99 or
actually trigger anything, because the tensions in technology were already so high that one wrong move or one domino falling could have literally led to the end of the world. The Bonilla observation. This genuinely might be my favorite story in the entire video. In the year 1883, there was a Mexican astronomer named Jose Bonilla, and during a regular shift, Bonilla noticed something relatively obscure in his telescope. And for this reason, Bonilla took many photographs and wrote many notes of what he was seeing through his telescope. Interestingly, the photos that he took are regarded as some of the first images of unidentified flying objects, but trust me when I say this section has nothing to do with aliens. The objects that were seen through the telescope were basically impossible to decipher. Like, just look at this image on screen right now. Can you tell what that is? And for that reason, it was basically left to speculation. Bonilla ended up spending 2 days taking 447 ink photographs of the objects he was seeing through his telescope. And in the following years, Bonilla actually had his observations published in a French astronomy magazine. And French astronomers that observed Bonilla's photographs essentially said pretty confidently that there was either birds flying above the telescope or insects crawling on the telescope or something along that line. And roughly 40 years later, in 1920, Bonilla passed away. And while that is where Bonilla's story ends, that's not where the story of his observation ends. Because in October of 2011, 90 years after Bonilla had passed away, another Mexican astronomer decided to take a peek at some of Bonilla's photos. And the conclusion that he came to was not that he had seen geese or dust or bugs, but he actually had witnessed a comet exploding in space. And these modern-day Mexican astronomers were able to extrapolate that, assuming that Bonilla's timings and notes were correct when observing his UFO through his telescope, it's believed that the objects that he was witnessing were roughly 500 to 8,000 kilometers above Earth's surface and roughly 70 meters to 800 meters in length. And because Bonilla observed 447 objects in roughly 3 hours and over 3,200 objects in a 25-hour period, the modern-day astronomers estimated that the original comet before it exploded had a mass that was roughly equivalent to 8 times of Halley's Comet. But they not only estimated the size of the original comet, but also said that if any of the fragments of this broken comet had impacted with the Earth, it would have likely been the equivalent of 3,275 Tunguska events in 2 days. And if that means nothing to you, then just understand that the Tunguska event was a massive explosion roughly 3 to 50 megatons in size that took place in Russia in 1908. That singular explosion alone was significant. But what these astronomers are claiming is that if these comet fragments that flew extremely close to the Earth had impacted with the Earth, it would have resulted in an explosion over 100,000 megatons in size, causing something they called, quote, probably an extinction event. And while the thought of this story is absolutely terrifying, I also kind of love the implications. There was a Mexican astronomer who saw something interesting and spent 2 days studying. He submits his notes and photos for publishing in France, and they basically go, oh, you saw a bird, you saw a bug. He then dies, and 100 years later, other Mexican astronomers are like, oh, no, that's not a bird or a bug. That was basically the closest we've ever come to asteroid-induced human annihilation in, well, a long time. The Lake Toba eruption. Every situation we've discussed so far has occurred in roughly modern history. However, this is the turning point of the video where we get prehistory. prehistoric. Which is actually a good thing because the situations we're about to discuss are literally insane. And the Lake Toba super eruption is a great start to the second half of this list. Lake Toba, Indonesia is the modern day location of one of the most severe volcanic eruptions possibly in all of Earth's history. And it's believed by some that the result of this eruption was a trackable decline in human genetic variation. But let me take a step back. The Toba super eruption that we're discussing is actually the most recent in a series of eruptions that happened in the same volcano. This Toba eruption we're discussing took place only 74,000 years ago. And I say only because the eruption that took place before this one took place 1.2 million years ago. Meaning that within the context, this one wasn't too long ago. Regardless, this eruption was significant. And as I mentioned, it was a super eruption. And what qualifies it as a super eruption was the fact that it had an estimated volcanic index of 8, making it the largest known explosive volcanic eruption in almost all of Earth's history. And I know that kind of just sounds like a lot of big numbers, but to kind of try to put this in a bit of context, in 2022, when the Hunga Tonga eruption took place, that volcanic eruption was estimated to have released 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash. And if you look at the pictures and videos and satellite imagery of that explosion, that is so much ash that was released, and it was truly a devastating event. However, if you think 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash is a lot, the Toba super eruption released 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. And this volcanic material had a major impact on the Earth's climate. Unsurprisingly, this volcanic eruption caused a volcanic winter, but this winter was rather significant, not only because it blocked out the sun's rays from entering the Earth's atmosphere, causing a global cooling by several degrees, but it's also believed that this period caused a 1,000-year cold period following the initial volcanic winter. Although that claim is disputed by some, and others say it would have only lasted 3 to 6 years before temperatures would have gotten within a few degrees of, once again, normal. Regardless if the cooling period was 6 years or 1,000 years, the effects were the same. Crops and vegetation across the world withered and died off, causing animals to die, and therefore massive famines among early human populations. And this volcanic winter